During a deadly tornado, the residents of Sanders County found their only storm shelter locked shut. HOA Chairman Roy Baxter coldly refused them entry, claiming no permit was approved. But former SWAT veteran Frank Grayson had his own plan, and he wasn't about to let red tape cost lives. Just wait until you see how this disaster turned into a fight for justice, and why the ending shook the whole town. The wind didn't just blow that evening. It roared like a train through the flatlands of Sanders County, twisting trees and slamming window shutters with wild, rhythmic violence. The sky had shifted from blue to a sickly gray, then to a deep greenish hue that looked like something straight out of a doomsday movie. Thunder didn't crack. It rolled like distant explosions, growing louder with each passing second. Becky stood in her kitchen, one hand clutching the edge of the counter, the other squeezing her phone, which buzzed with yet another emergency alert. The screen glared red. Take shelter immediately. EF4, tornado approaching from the south. Her 5-year-old daughter Claire was already crying, curled up in a pink blanket under the dining table. The sirens outside screamed like banshees, long and shrill, drilling straight into the nerves. Becky's heart thudded. This wasn't a drill. This wasn't one of those summer storms that passed with a little wind and some neighborhood gossip. This was different. This was real. She knew exactly where to go. 2 years ago, their HOA had installed a community storm shelter, an underground concrete room reinforced with steel beams, fitted with ventilation, emergency lighting, and space for 30 people max. It was the one place that could guarantee safety in a storm like this, and it was only 200 feet from their front door. Without hesitating, Becky grabbed Claire, wrapping the blanket around her tighter, and rushed out the front door into the chaos. Rain came sideways, sharp as needles, soaking them instantly. Leaves whipped across the lawn. She could already see the silhouette of the tornado in the distance, a swirling black funnel dancing low on the horizon, devouring trees and lifting debris into the air like confetti at the world's most terrifying parade. They ran, Becky shielding Claire with her arms, her own breath catching in her throat with every step. The ground vibrated faintly beneath their feet. A car alarm blared to their left as branches slammed against a pickup. She didn't stop, didn't look back. The shelter was in view now, a squat, ugly structure with a thick metal door bolted into the ground. She reached it just as another gust nearly knocked her sideways. The door didn't move. Becky yanked the handle again, harder, still nothing. Her hands slipped. She looked down. A chain, a heavy-duty lock, and a brand-new steel chain wrapped tight across the handles. "No," she breathed, voice trembling. "No, no, no. This has to be a mistake." She pounded on the door with her fist. The metal rang back, indifferent. Claire whimpered, burying her face into Becky's chest. Lightning cracked behind them, lighting up the massive funnel, now shockingly close. Closer than she'd ever seen anything that big and alive and angry. There was a paper taped just above the lock. Rain had blurred the ink, but she could still make out the words burned into the page. Facility temporarily closed per HOA directive. Access restricted until further notice. Her knees buckled slightly. Rage surged. She screamed at the door, not even knowing what she hoped to achieve. The sky behind them boiled with thunder, and the lock, gleaming and solid, stayed exactly where it was. The wind howled louder now, a monstrous, rising wail that made Claire sob uncontrollably. Becky pulled her closer, shielding the girl's face from the rain and the chaos, whispering, "It's okay, baby. We'll be safe soon." But even she didn't believe her own words. The injustice of it all burned hotter than the lightning flashing around them. Someone had made a decision to lock that door, not an accident, not a fluke, a choice. Someone, safe in their home, had decided to leave them and every other family in the neighborhood outside. She glanced behind her again. The funnel was almost upon them now, its wide base swallowing the fields beyond the road. Debris whipped past her head. Claire screamed. Becky dropped to her knees and clutched her daughter tighter, heart pounding. This couldn't be it. Not here. Not like this. There had to be something. Anything. But all she could see was that lock. That cold, deliberate lock. "What is this?" Becky shouted, slamming her fists against the metal door with growing desperation. Her voice barely carried over the roar of the wind, but it was enough to catch attention. One by one, neighbors emerged from their homes, some barefoot, some dragging blankets or pets, all wide-eyed and frantic. The sky was now a churning sea of green and gray, and the sirens wailed louder, more urgent, more final. Becky grabbed the lock with trembling hands and shook it hard. It didn't budge. The chain clanged against the frame, solid and unyielding. A laminated sign was taped above the handle, flapping wildly in the wind and soaked through by rain. She squinted to read it. The ink bled, but the message was clear enough to stop her breath. Closed by order of HOA. Shelter unavailable due to sanitation concerns and lack of evacuation permit approval. She stared at the words in disbelief, heart pounding, lungs burning from the sprint. Behind her, someone screamed. Another person shouted, "Let us in!" But there was no one on the other side to hear it. The bunker stood silent, locked, indifferent. Mrs. Ginny, a widow from 2 houses down, clung to her porch railing before stumbling towards them, her nightgown whipping like a flag in the wind. Her face was pale, eyes wide with terror. "This is illegal," she cried, voice cracking. "We pay our dues. That shelter belongs to all of us. We have the right to be inside." No one answered. No one could. The wind screamed like a freight train barreling down a mountain, and the trees bent at impossible angles. A flash of lightning revealed the funnel, now clearly visible behind the treetops, wide, dark, and merciless. Jared, a young man in cargo shorts and a hoodie soaked through, was frantically tapping his phone. "I've got Baxter on the line," he shouted, holding the device to his ear with shaking hands. Becky turned, clutching Claire tighter. "Tell him to open it now." Jared nodded. "Mr. Baxter, sir, people are outside the shelter. There's a tornado coming. We need that door opened immediately." A pause. Then, over the speakerphone, came a voice. Calm, cold. "This is a temporary closure," said Roy Baxter, the head of the HOA. "The facility does not currently meet sanitation codes, and no emergency evacuation approval has been granted. I'm sorry, but we can't risk spreading contamination." Becky stared at the phone like it had just betrayed her. "Contamination? Are you kidding? There's a tornado coming straight at us." Baxter didn't raise his voice. "Ma'am, the HOA provided advance notice about the weather. Residents were encouraged to evacuate yesterday. Responsibility was clearly outlined in the bulletin." "We've got 5 minutes," Becky screamed, her voice cracking. Claire cried harder against her shoulder. "We're going to die out here." But the line had already gone dead. Jared stared at the screen. He hung up. No one spoke. The wind filled the silence, howling louder, pushing against them like a living thing. Becky looked around at the terrified faces, then back at the locked shelter door. Her fists clenched. She felt helpless, furious, betrayed. This wasn't just negligence. It was abandonment. A black, battle-worn ram truck idled on the edge of the road, its engine growling low like some kind of caged animal. Rain streaked across the windshield in relentless waves, but the driver sat still, unmoved by the chaos outside. Then, with slow deliberation, the door creaked open. A man stepped out. He wasn't tall in the dramatic sense, but he moved with the kind of gravity that made people get out of the way. Camouflage jacket faded from sun and age, combat boots dark with mud. His shoulders were squared, posture military, each step precise and deliberate, as if rehearsed over years in sandstorms and alleyways far from here. His face told its own story, etched with long, pale scars that cut across weathered skin like roads on a map. But it was the eyes that made people stop, cold, sharp, calculating, like they'd already measured the outcome 3 moves ahead. Frank Grayson didn't run anymore. He didn't panic. He assessed, measured, executed. That's how you survived 2 decades in special weapons and tactics. That's how you got out when others didn't. Becky saw him from the cluster of panicked neighbors and froze. For a heartbeat, she was 5 years old again, watching him walk through the door in full gear, boots still dusty from deployment. But now, she wasn't a child. And she was holding one of her own. She broke from the crowd, sprinting across the soaked pavement, with Claire clutched to her chest. Her voice cracked through the wind. "Dad, they won't let us in. The bunker, it's locked." Frank didn't flinch. He turned his head slowly, eyes landing on the storm shelter, like it was a target he'd trained for. His gaze moved from the heavy steel door to the posted sign to the massive funnel cloud on the horizon. The tornado was closer now, lower, spinning like a curse. Thunder cracked again, so loud it shook the ground beneath them. He said nothing. Becky reached him, breathless and crying, pushing Claire into his arms like some desperate offering to the only force she trusted more than herself. "It's HOA," she choked out. "They locked it. They said something about permits. Dad, please." Frank didn't ask questions. He didn't offer comfort. He just handed Claire back gently, patted her on the head, and stepped past Becky without a word. There was no panic in his face, no rush in his movements, only purpose. He walked back toward the ram, water sloshing around his boots, the wind catching the tails of his jacket. Inside the truck bed, covered in a dark tarp, was an old military storage crate, padlocked, heavy. He popped the latch in one fluid motion. Becky followed, her voice shaking. "What are you doing?" Frank glanced at the sky, just once, then lifted the lid and pulled out a thick, weathered duffel bag, olive green, marked with faded black letters, the kind of bag that never carried clothes. "I told the county this would happen someday," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "Told him a storm like this would come, and someone would try to follow rules while people died." Becky felt a cold knot twist in her stomach. Frank slung the bag over his shoulder and shut the truck with one heavy slam. The storm howled louder. The first pieces of debris danced across the road like angry ghosts. She looked at him, realizing exactly what was in that bag. "You can't, Dad, you can't just blow it open." He turned to her calmly, voice steady as stone. "They made a choice, Becky. So now I'm making mine." Then he walked toward the shelter. Frank returned through the curtain of wind and rain, carrying a hard-edged military case in both hands. The storm screamed around him, but he moved like he was back in a combat zone, measured, unshaken, each bootstep planted with unwavering control. The case was solid green metal, scratched and dented from age and history, its latches still holding firm. He set it down in front of the shelter door with the care of someone placing a sacred object. People stepped back instinctively, the air around him changing. Even the wind seemed to pause. With a practiced flick of his wrist, he popped the case open and revealed a neatly packed set of tools, wires, and, at its center, a small, round device no larger than a compact disc, surrounded by insulated padding. It looked ordinary. It wasn't. This was a thermal breaching charge, compact, efficient, meant for steel. Technically restricted. Definitely not standard civilian gear. Frank didn't blink. He uncoiled a length of wire and crouched beside the shelter door, inspecting the hinges with the quiet concentration of someone who'd done this 100 times before. His fingers moved fast but precisely, eyes scanning for the best placement. He wasn't guessing, he was solving. Becky rushed to him, shielding Claire against her chest, rain streaking down her face in frantic lines. "Dad, wait, are you sure? This isn't legal," she said, her voice cracking as thunder rolled overhead. Frank didn't look up. "Tornado doesn't care about legal," he said evenly, pressing the device against the steel hinge with firm pressure. It locked into place with a soft click. He stood up slowly, wiped his wet hands on his jacket, and turned to face her. "They picked paperwork," he said simply, eyes locked with hers. "I pick you." That was it. He pulled her back gently, hand resting on her shoulder for a brief second, then raised his voice to the crowd. "Everyone, move back, 30 feet minimum." Nobody questioned him. Families backed away, pulling strollers, bags, and each other into a shaky semicircle behind the oak tree across the path. Becky held Claire tighter than ever, heart pounding so loud it drowned out the sirens. Frank stepped back slowly, remote in hand, eyes fixed on the door. The wind surged again, tossing loose branches through the air like thrown spears. The funnel cloud was now a monster in full form, wide, dark, and menacing. It growled over the treetops like a war drum. He pressed the trigger. The sound wasn't what most expected. No fireball, no sharp bang, just a deep, muffled thump, like someone had punched the earth with a giant steel fist. The shelter door groaned once, then buckled inward with a shriek of tearing metal. The chain snapped. The lock clattered to the wet ground. Smoke hissed in a single white ribbon from the hinge, then silence. For a beat, the world held its breath. Frank stepped forward and pulled the door open with one strong tug. It gave way without resistance. He turned, rain soaking his face, and nodded once. "Go." That was all anyone needed. They surged forward, not with panic, but with purpose. Parents carrying toddlers, elderly couples helping each other down the steps. Claire reached for Frank as she passed, but he simply patted her back and guided her in. Becky paused at the door, looking at him. Her father, the man who had never followed rules just to follow them, the man who stood between bureaucracy and survival. "You coming in?" she asked. Frank shook his head. "I'll be the last." She hesitated, then disappeared into the shelter, and Frank stood alone at the threshold, watching the sky descend like judgment. One by one, families poured into the shelter, like water breaking through a dam, some holding crying children, others guiding elderly parents with trembling hands. A pregnant woman leaned on her husband as they descended the narrow concrete stairs. No one pushed, no one spoke louder than necessary. The fear outside was enough to keep everyone moving with reverent urgency. Inside, the shelter was dim but dry. Concrete walls surrounded the room, thick and unforgiving. An old generator hummed in the corner, powered by a long disconnected emergency circuit that somehow still worked. The air smelled like dust, rubber, and metal. Folding benches lined two of the walls, some already broken, from years of neglect or past storms. It wasn't perfect, but it was safe. Frank stayed at the door. He didn't follow them in. Not yet. Instead, he stood at the threshold, rain beating against his back as he scanned the perimeter. His eyes darted to the ceiling, the vents, the emergency hatch above the ladder on the far wall. He moved like a man inspecting an aircraft before takeoff. Every detail mattered. His brain was still running operational checks, even as the ground outside trembled beneath the roar of the sky. He stepped to the side and examined the bulkhead. Small cracks, superficial. Structural integrity, solid. But just to be sure, he grabbed one of the broken bench legs, metal and rusted but still strong, and wedged it against the door frame as a brace. Then another. He moved quickly, fashioning a web of reinforcement around the hinges and base of the frame. It wouldn't stop a direct hit, but it might give them just enough time. A teenage boy watched him silently from across the room, clutching a younger sibling in his arms. Frank nodded once at him, and the boy nodded back, eyes wide with a new understanding. Finished with the door, Frank turned and made a slow circle of the shelter interior. He tapped each vent cover, checked the emergency supplies stacked in plastic tubs in the far corner, and secured a loose handle on the hatch above. The lights flickered once, then steadied. Only then did he allow himself to stop. He sat down on an overturned storage crate near the entryway, his back leaning against the wall, arms resting on his knees. His chest rose and fell in heavy, slow breaths, the kind a man takes not from exhaustion, but release, the kind that says, for now, everyone was alive. Outside, the tornado roared like a living beast. The wind howled, and above them the shelter shook. Dust fell from the ceiling in brief flurries. Somewhere in the distance, something large was torn from the ground with a groan and a crash that echoed underground like thunder inside a cave. No one inside moved. A young man, maybe 19, stood near the center of the room. He looked at Frank, then at the door, then back at Frank. "We'd all be gone if it weren't for him," he said, loud enough for the others to hear. Murmurs spread through the crowd. People nodded. Someone whispered a quiet, "Thank you." A mother hugged her child tighter. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was full. Full of recognition, of understanding, of gratitude too deep for words. Becky stood across the room, her back against the wall, still holding Claire. Her daughter had finally stopped crying, now sleeping fitfully in her arms. Becky's eyes never left her father. For so long, she'd written off his caution as paranoia, his warnings, his stockpiles, the endless drills and rants about systems failing when you need them most. She'd laughed, called it overkill. Now she saw something else entirely. Not just a man preparing for war, but a man who knew the world could break and chose to be ready anyway. She watched as Frank sat there, alone in his corner, not asking for thanks, not basking in the moment, just listening to the storm. And in that moment, Becky didn't see a grizzled old veteran chasing ghosts. She saw a protector. She saw a hero. The first light of dawn spilled through the narrow skylight in the shelter's emergency hatch, casting a dusty golden beam across the floor. The storm had passed, But its echo lingered. Broken branches, scattered debris, and a silence so sharp it felt like the world was still catching its breath. Families stirred slowly, blinking in the pale light. Children clung to parents. Conversations were whispered. Relief was tangible, but so was anger. A black SUV pulled up outside. The sound of gravel crunching under tires echoed through the morning air, followed by the opening and closing of a car door with crisp finality. Frank heard it before anyone else. He stood, brushing dust from his jacket, and stepped toward the shelter entrance. Outside stood Roy Baxter. The HOA chairman wore a dark tailored suit despite the mud. His polished shoes were comically out of place among the debris. One hand clutched a digital tablet, the other adjusted his collar with the smug precision of someone who hadn't spent the night hiding from a tornado. Behind him stood two uniformed officers and a local news van with its camera already rolling. Baxter didn't wait for pleasantries. "Franklin Grayson," he called out, voice amplified with practiced indignation. "You are under arrest for unlawful entry into municipal property, destruction of HOA assets, and reckless endangerment." He turned slightly toward the camera. "This man detonated an explosive device on community infrastructure. There will be consequences." Frank stepped fully into the daylight. His boots crunched broken glass underfoot. He didn't raise his hands. He didn't step back. He just looked Baxter square in the eye. "I saved 37 people last night," Frank said, calm as stone. "Children, seniors, a pregnant woman. You locked the door." Baxter's jaw twitched. That facility was closed under emergency health provisions. "You locked the door," Frank repeated, louder now. "You read the forecast. You saw the alerts. And when your neighbors called for help, you laughed." Gasps rippled through the growing crowd. Residents were emerging from the shelter, blinking in the light, listening. Becky stepped forward, holding up her phone. "I recorded the call, all of it," she said, hands steady. She tapped the screen, and the audio filled the space between them. Baxter's voice crackled through the speaker, calm, dismissive, even smug. "Sanitation violations. Should have evacuated yesterday. Not our problem." Then the laughter, nervous, arrogant, cold. One of the officers shifted uncomfortably. The other narrowed his eyes at Baxter. Frank crossed his arms. "Still want to talk about consequences?" Baxter looked between them, lips parting like he was searching for the right script. The camera was still rolling. His gaze flicked toward it, then back to Frank. This isn't about emotions," Baxter stammered. "There are legal channels." "No," Becky cut in. "This is about people, about your responsibility to them. You locked the only safe place we had. You left us to die." Another resident stepped forward, then another, then more. A wall of witnesses, faces still drawn from the night before, all staring at one man in a clean suit. The police officer nearest to Baxter cleared his throat. "Sir, we're going to need to take a statement from you. Please hand over your tablet and step aside." "What?" Baxter recoiled. "He's the one who—" The officer raised a hand. "We've got multiple eyewitnesses, a recording, and a building full of survivors. You'll have your chance, but you're not walking away from this." Frank didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He just stood in the morning light, the man who chose people over policy. And for the first time in a long time, Becky felt the world tilt back towards right. By the next morning, the story had exploded. News channels replayed the footage over and over. Frank in the rain, the broken shelter door, the terrified families. Headlines were brutal and direct. HOA locked shelter during tornado. Veterans saves dozens as bureaucrats delay. Public outrage caught like dry grass in wind. Clips of Roy Baxter's call played on loop. His dismissive tone, his laughter, it enraged people. Hashtags trended across platforms. #HO failure, #Hero Frank, #Open the shelters. Petitions gained thousands of signatures by the hour. Crowds formed outside HOA offices. Parents held photos of their kids. Veterans showed up in uniform, arms folded, eyes cold. One sign read, "He didn't break the law. He broke the lock and saved us." Within 24 hours, the district attorney stepped in. Roy Baxter was arrested for endangering lives during a declared emergency. The charges were serious. And this time, there was video, audio, and a shelter full of witnesses. Frank's charges didn't last long. Prosecutors dropped them, reclassifying his actions as justified under emergency defense. The word used in the report was heroic. He didn't do interviews. He didn't stand at rallies. He sat on his porch with a cup of coffee and watched it all unfold on the evening news. But Becky did speak. She stood in front of a live camera, holding Claire's hand. My dad didn't think. He just moved, because someone had to. That one line ran on national television for 2 days. Frank never smiled for the cameras. He didn't have to. The country already knew who he was. Frank never liked crowds. He didn't do well with ceremonies, speeches, or spotlight moments. But when the fire department invited him to the town's emergency services building for a formal recognition event, he didn't say no. He simply nodded once and showed up in a clean shirt, polished boots, and the same quiet presence that had carried him through the storm. The room was full. Families he'd helped rescue stood shoulder to shoulder with first responders. Local officials filled the front row, some with notepads, others with shame still lingering on their faces. Children sat on laps. Reporters stayed back for once. The podium was draped in red, white, and blue, and above it hung a banner, "In gratitude for bravery beyond duty." Becky stood near the front holding Claire, who clutched a small bouquet of wildflowers someone had given her. The little girl wore a bright blue dress and kept twisting in her mother's arms, looking for her grandfather. When Frank's name was called, the applause was instant. It started loud and didn't fade. People rose to their feet. Some clapped, some whistled, a few wiped tears. He didn't bask in it. He didn't even smile. He just walked forward with a firm, steady pace and nodded once to the chief, who placed a medal around his neck, thin silver, etched with the words, "For courage in civil emergency." The chief stepped aside. The room fell quiet. Frank looked over the crowd, then down at Claire. For a moment, he said nothing. Then Becky whispered in her daughter's ear. Claire squirmed upright and called out, clear as day, "Thank you for not being scared, Grandpa." The silence cracked with gentle laughter, followed by another round of applause. Frank crouched down and opened his arms. Claire ran to him. He lifted her gently, rested her on his hip, and leaned in. "Sometimes," he said softly, "doing what's right means doing it your own way." Becky wiped her eyes. It wasn't just a medal. It wasn't just a moment. Soon after, a new ordinance was passed unanimously by the county board. All community storm shelters, regardless of ownership, would remain unlocked and accessible during any declared weather emergency. No exceptions, no paperwork, no politics. The law was named the Grayson Act. It was printed in the paper. But for Frank, the real victory wasn't legislation. It was seeing people safe. It was holding his granddaughter. It was standing in a room full of neighbors, some who once thought him paranoid, now looking at him with respect. Not just for what he'd done that night, but for everything he had stood for long before it became necessary. That night, he returned home and sat on his porch again. The same chair, the same quiet sky. But this time, it didn't feel like he was waiting for the world to fall apart. This time, it felt like something had been rebuilt, something that might just last.